$400 billion. That is the annual revenue of a single industry built on the quiet burial of a recipe that costs less than $3 to mix in a kitchen bowl. Not a crypto scheme, not a leveraged derivative, a paste made from boiled rice and powdered lime that holds bricks together so tightly that modern demolition equipment stalls against walls assembled with it 6 centuries ago. And the reason you have never heard of it, the reason no engineering school on earth teaches it as a primary binding method, has nothing to do with performance failure. It has everything to do with the oldest financial mechanism in human history. You cannot build a recurring revenue model on something a homeowner can make in a saucepan. You cannot patent a starch molecule. You cannot run quarterly earnings calls on a substance that peasant farmers once stirred together over a cooking fire. So the product disappeared, not from reality, from the conversation. Hold that thought. Because this is not a construction video. This is a lesson about the architecture of every wealth system you have ever trusted with your paycheck. The pattern you're about to watch unfold in mortar and brick is the same pattern running silently through your brokerage account, your insurance premiums, your mortgage terms, and the financial advice you consume every single day. Industries do not suppress free solutions by arguing against them. They suppress free solutions by building walls of academic silence and marketing noise so thick that you never encounter the alternative in the first place. And once you see how it works in one domain, you cannot unsee it anywhere. The year is 1368. A former peasant named Zhu Yuanzhang has just seized the Chinese throne and declared himself the Hongwu emperor. His most urgent problem is infrastructure. The northern frontier stands open, Mongol cavalry camps on the steppe, waiting. The Great Wall exists, but centuries of freeze-thaw cycles have turned its older sections into sagging ridges of dirt. Standard lime mortar, the same formula Roman engineers used, cracks every winter when water expands inside the joints and crumbles every spring when it contracts. Decades of maintenance budgets poured into walls that dissolve like sugar cubes in rain. So Ming engineers deploy a recipe that had been quietly refined over 1,000 years by regional craftsmen but never scaled to imperial ambition. They take ordinary slaked lime and fold in one organic additive that no European mason had ever considered combining with construction material. Sticky rice, boiled, mashed, stirred into the calcium paste while still warm. The mortar that results does something no lime-only formula can do. It locks bricks into a matrix so dense that earthquake forces pass through the structure without separating the joints. Monsoon rains that dissolve standard mortar run off the surface like water off glass. Weed roots, mountain tree roots, even the persistent root systems that split granite over decades cannot pry the seams apart. Tombs sealed with this paste have held airtight for over 500 years without a single crack wide enough for a blade of grass. For nearly 3 centuries, every major imperial project in China runs on this formula. The Forbidden City, the walls of Xi'an, the walls of Nanjing, which have shrugged off 600 years of typhoons, floods, and artillery bombardment. The Shooting Bridge in Zhejiang province. Royal tombs scattered across the empire, all of it bonded by 2 ingredients that any household already owned. The cost per batch, adjusted for labor and materials, amounts to almost nothing. The durability outperforms every commercial product that would follow it by half a millennium. And then the dynasty collapses. The recipe does not get published. It does not enter an open archive. It passes mouth to mouth through mason guilds, lineages of craftsmen whose numbers thin as China slides into the upheaval of the 19th century. Guildmasters die without apprentices. Trade secrets evaporate into oral tradition, then into silence. Meanwhile, across the ocean in England, a man named Joseph Aspdin files a patent in 1824 for a teat powder. He calls Portland cement, and from that single patent filing, an industry begins to crystallize that will eventually command $400 billion a year in global revenue. Not because its product outperforms the ancient formula, because its product can be packaged, branded, shipped, and sold on repeat. The sticky rice formula had already begun retreating into obscurity. By the time Western missionaries and engineers arrived in Professor Bingjian Zhang at Zhejiang University proved it in 2010. His team pulled mortar samples from Ming Dynasty walls, structures poured in 1368, and ran them through scanning, electron microscopy, X-ray diffraction, and thermogravimetric analysis. Published the results in Accounts of Chemical Research, one of the highest-ranked chemistry journals on the planet. What they confirmed was not sentimental folklore. It was a measurable, repeatable, material science fact. The amylopectin starch molecules were still chemically active in those joints after 600 years, still bonded to the calcium carbonate matrix, still holding. Now compare that lifespan to what you are actually purchasing when you hire a mason today. Modern cement mortar in a residential wall begins showing microfractures within 15 to 25 years. Repointing a single-family brick home costs between $8,000 and $25,000 depending on your city. If you own that home for 40 years, you are statistically facing that bill at least once, possibly twice. Multiply that across the roughly 83 million owner-occupied homes in the United States alone, and the repointing market becomes a recurring extraction engine worth hundreds of billions across a single generation of homeowners. A material that lasts 6 centuries does not generate repointing contracts. It does not sell waterproofing membranes. It does not move sump pumps or epoxy coatings off warehouse shelves. The iodine starch test Zhang performed is not complicated. Any undergraduate chemistry student can replicate it. The starch was still there, still functioning as a crystal growth regulator inside joints that bulldozers have physically failed to break apart. That is not a legend. That is a lab result with a DOI number anyone can look up tonight. Zhang's paper laid the molecular mechanism bare. When you boil glutinous rice, varieties that run nearly 100% amylopectin with almost zero amylose, and stir that thick porridge into slaked lime, the hydroxyl groups on those branched starch chains lock onto calcium ions. They form an organic-inorganic hybrid composite, structurally analogous to the collagen mineral weave inside living bone. That is not poetic language. That is the published description from a peer-reviewed journal. And the financial implication is devastating because it means the superior product was never technologically out of reach. It was economically inconvenient for every corporation whose quarterly earnings depend on your walls falling apart on schedule. The carbonation reaction is where the money disappears from their balance sheet entirely. Lime mortar does not cure by evaporation the way cement does. It hardens by slowly absorbing carbon dioxide from the air, converting calcium hydroxide into calcium carbonate, essentially rebuilding itself into limestone. Without the rice starch present, that process creates large brittle crystals, a porous matrix you can scratch with a fingernail. But when amylopectin threads through that reaction, something fundamentally different happens at the crystal level. Here is the part no one frames correctly. You just heard what happens at the molecular level when starch meets calcium hydroxide. 30 times the compressive strength. Resistance to water immersion measured in months, not hours. Walls still curing after 600 years. Now ask yourself the only question that actually matters in a financial system. Who loses money if that formula goes mainstream? Follow the depreciation schedule. A Portland cement structure has a useful lifespan of 50 to 100 years. That is not a flaw the industry is trying to fix. That is the business model. Every highway bridge poured in the 1960s is crumbling right now, and civil engineers across the country are issuing warnings about nationwide infrastructure collapse. Reinforced concrete towers from the 1970s are spalling open, rebar rusting, expanding, cracking the structure apart from the inside out. And every single one of those failures triggers a new purchase order. New cement, new contracts, new revenue flowing upward to the same 5 companies that control most of the global supply. Holcim. Heidelberg Materials, Cemex, Anhui, Conch. Ultratech. Over $400 billion a year, every year, cycling through a system that depends on one elegant trick. Making sure the thing you build today needs to be rebuilt within your mortgage lender's planning horizon. Now stand on the other side of that ledger. A section of the Nanjing city wall, bonded with sticky rice mortar in the late 1300s, is so structurally intact that modern demolition crews cannot bring it down without specialized cutting equipment. A Ming-era tomb tested in the early 2000s took a direct push from a heavy bulldozer running at full throttle. The wall did not crack, the mortar did not crumble. The bulldozer backed off. That is not a construction anecdote, that is a financial threat. Because if a binder exists that lasts 6 centuries instead of 6 decades, the entire recurring revenue logic of the cement industry collapses overnight. No scheduled repairs, no predictable retrofit cycles, no depreciation curve that forces property owners back into the supply chain every few decades. This is the value stratification you are living inside and cannot see. The ownership class does not need to work harder or innovate faster. They need your assets to decay on a predictable timeline, so you re-enter their market as a buyer again and again. Your effort, your savings, your 30-year mortgage, all of it feeds a cycle where the thing you purchased is engineered to require repurchase. The formula that breaks that cycle costs less than $3 to mix in a kitchen bowl. 2 ingredients available at any hardware store. And the reason you have never heard of it is not because it failed a single scientific test. It is because no corporation can patent boiled rice and hydrated lime. You cannot run a licensing model on a starch molecule. You cannot build quarterly earnings projections on a product that makes your customer permanently self-sufficient. The suppression is not dramatic. There are no locked vaults or burned manuscripts. It is quieter than that and far more effective. It lives in what gets taught and what gets omitted, what gets stocked and what never reaches the shelf, what gets recommended by default, and what requires you to actively seek out against the current of an entire industry's inertia. And that quiet architecture of omission is precisely how the wealth transfer stays invisible, how the people paying never realize they are paying for a problem that was solved 6 centuries ago. But the chemistry does not care about revenue models, and what happens when that rigid cement meets seasonal expansion tells you exactly why the damage compounds in a direction that only benefits one side of the transaction. $2,000. That is the average quote a homeowner receives to repoint a brick chimney or patch a stone foundation. The contractor shows up, pulls out bags of Portland cement from the back of his truck, and charges you for labor, materials, and expertise. The materials cost him roughly $40. His expertise in most cases amounts to doing what the hardware store told him to do, and the result, as every preservation authority on the planet has documented in excruciating detail, actively destroys your wall over the following decade. Salts leach into the brick. Rigid cement refuses to flex with seasonal temperature shifts. Cracks propagate along every boundary between old stone and new filler. You paid $2,000 to accelerate the decay of your own home. That is not a renovation. That is a subscription to future damage, billed up front. Now, here is the action. Not a philosophy, not a mindset shift. A physical, boring, 20-minute procedure that costs less than the price of a sandwich. You walk into any Asian grocery store or the international aisle of a regular supermarket, and you pick up a 1-pound bag of glutinous rice flour, $3 to $5. You walk into any hardware store or garden center and you buy a 4-pound bag of hydrated lime, sometimes labeled slaked lime, or calcium hydroxide, $8 to $12, and that single bag covers dozens of repairs. You go home, you put 2 tablespoons of the rice flour into a small saucepan with 1 cup of cold water. You whisk it until there are no lumps. You place it over medium heat, stir constantly, and within 3 minutes, you watch cloudy white liquid transform into a thick, translucent paste with the consistency of thin pudding. You set it aside to cool. While it cools, you pour 2 cups of hydrated lime into a clean bucket. You add water slowly, stirring with a wooden stick, until you have a smooth paste the thickness of yogurt. Wear a dust mask during this step. Lime powder is caustic and will irritate your lungs. Once it is wet, the paste is far safer, but keep gloves on because prolonged skin contact with alkaline material burns. Then you combine the two, cooled rice paste into the lime slurry. Stir hard for several minutes. The mixture turns slightly off-white with a faint creamy tint. It should hold its shape on a trowel without sliding. Too thin, add more lime. Too thick, a splash of water. Historical Ming Dynasty. Construction texts specify roughly 3% rice content by weight relative to the lime. You can push it to 5% for joints that need extreme water resistance. That is the entire formula. The same formula that built walls bulldozers cannot crack. The same chemistry that has held joints sealed for 600 years without a single weed breaking through. And the reason you never heard of it is not because it failed. It is because no corporation can patent boiled rice and powdered lime. You cannot build a recurring revenue model on 2 ingredients a homeowner mixes in a saucepan. So, the global cement industry, a $400 billion per year machine, did what every extraction system does when a free solution outperforms its product. It buried the recipe under marketing budgets and academic silence and let 3 generations forget. The action is not glamorous. It is stirring powder in a bucket on a Saturday afternoon. It is 20 minutes of your time and $3 of groceries, replacing a $2,000 invoice that would have wrecked your masonry within 10 years. But that is precisely why it works as a pattern interrupt. Every financial trap you have ever walked into shares the same architecture. An industry sells complexity to justify a price tag. The actual solution is mechanical, cheap, and boring. Your only job, the one move that severs the old habit, is to spend those 20 minutes with your hands in the bucket before you ever pick up the phone to call a contractor. Do the ugly, tedious, small thing first. Let the paste cool. Let the limatite set. And watch the quote you were about to pay dissolve into irrelevance because you just proved to yourself with physical evidence sitting on your workbench that the expensive answer was never the correct one. That single experience, $3 against $2,000, rewires something no spreadsheet can touch. It makes the next sales pitch feel transparent instead of authoritative. It makes the next invoice feel negotiable instead of inevitable. And once that shift locks in, once your hands remember what a real solution feels like compared to a marketed one, the instinct carries forward into every financial decision you face from that point on. Here is the part nobody tells you when they sell you a wealth strategy. Every system that compounds has a timeline attached to it, and that timeline is not negotiable. The wall that a Ming Dynasty mason pointed with sticky rice mortar did not reach full structural strength in a weekend. It reached functional hardness in 3 to 4 weeks. It resisted water penetration in 3 months. It approached its designed load capacity in a year, and then it kept strengthening, quietly, invisibly, for decades after the mason had packed up his tools and walked away. Your financial position works on the same carbonation schedule. The first 3 weeks of any new discipline feel like wet paste. You're pressing dollars into joints and smoothing the surface, and nothing looks different yet. Your neighbor, who hired a leveraged contractor who threw fast-setting Portland promises at the same problem, appears to be ahead of you. His wall looks finished. Yours is still under damp burlap. But here is what the chemistry tells you if you are patient enough to listen. Fast setting systems crack. They always crack. The contractor gets called back for repairs within 2 years because rigidity without flexibility is a structural death sentence. The homeowner, who chose the slow cure, who kept the surface moist, who let atmospheric reality do the bonding work at its own pace, ends up with joints that a metal scraper cannot mark. Translate that into a monthly budget, and the parallel is almost uncomfortable in its precision. The person who automates a small transfer, who covers the gap between income and obligation with a $3 discipline instead of a $300 product, who refuses to let the surface dry out by skipping months, that person builds a position that quietly resists financial water penetration. Not in a week, not in a quarter, but within a year, the cracks that used to appear every time an unexpected bill arrived simply stop forming. The survival buffer is not glamorous. It is damp burlap over fresh work. It is the 3 to 7 day window where you protect what you just laid down instead of exposing it to the full blast of lifestyle inflation. It is the decision to mist your emergency fund with $20 a week instead of letting it cure too fast into a number you feel comfortable rating. That buffer is what separates the wall that outlasts your children from the wall that needs a callback contractor before the second winter.